Hi, my name is David Cunillera-Montcusí. I'm a recently started Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellow in the CER and the Institute of Aquatic Ecology, and more specifically on the Metacom Lab together with Sofia Horvat. And unfortunately, I could not come to the CER days, but I got the chance to share my project with you and also my background. And I'm sure that at the end, during these 2 years that I will spend in Budapest, we will have a moment to discuss or to meet and explain a bit more in detail or share my project. But basically today, what I'm going to explain to you is a bit from where I am coming and what I'm going to do in Budapest in the next 2 years. Basically, from where I'm coming, I did my master's and bachelor and also my PhD in Girona in the Aquatic Institute of Ecology also. But also during my PhD, I did a short stay in Uruguay. My PhD, I did it with Stephanie Gascon and Dr. Dani Bosch, and my stay with Ana Inés Bortagaray and Matthias Arim. But later, I spent 1 year in Austria in the Aquascale Research Group with Dr. Robert Ptachnik, doing my first year of postdoc. And after that, I took a short contract in Barcelona with Miguel Cañedo and Nuria Bonada. That at the end led to the Dendrinet project, which was Margarita Salas Fellow, which is Spanish funding for early PhDs, early PhDs, or early researchers, actually, it's, which basically got me to work with the Driver project, H2020 project, and the Ponderful H2020 project. And now we are in 2023, and I'm starting my Marie Curie project, which is called Meta Heroes, that I will do, of course, in the CER, but also in the collaboration of Jonathan Chase, Ana Inés Bortagaray, and Matthias Arim. But more important of which contracts and which projects I've been related is what I did during this time. I started focusing on temporary ponds, their species and their diversity, and also their traits and functional aspects, trying to understand them, because on my thesis, I tried to frame them from a more zooming out perspective, so kind of more conceptual point of view, trying to understand how these communities were being shaped by 2 layers. The first one was wildfire, so the impact of wildfire on these communities, and the second one was network structure, and actually how this network structure was helping the resilience or was shaping the resilience of these communities against a disturbance such as wildfire. During my postdoc, basically I focused on alpine lakes, but also on the network structure and how it influences planktonic communities in this case. And also on a disturbance, specifically freshwater salinization, but from more a review point of view. Later, during my short contract, I worked with intermittent streams and the impacts of drying at the diversity also, for diversity of macroinvertebrates. But later, I tried to conceptualize these impacts on drying, on how it shapes connectivity throughout time, so kind of quantifying spatiotemporal connectivity changes linked to intermittent streams drying. And later on, more in a broader sense, with Uruguay, we also worked on a more continental connectivity point of view, trying to understand where and how connectivity hotspots are distributed throughout the continent, and more especially, and it's something that we are kind of finishing now, how these changes in connectivity are shaping diversity and specifically the response to fragmentation or landscape degradation of these diversity decay rates. So at the end, I've been going through different aquatic systems. I have kind of following a water cycle at different systems, but always in the same type of framework as I was telling, trying to understand the resilience of aquatic metacommunities to different types of disturbances and understanding them from a network point of view. So we have always the disturbance and the network structure kind of shaping these communities. The thesis was wildfire, but later it was freshwater salinization, drought, landscape, and land use changes. And of course, all of them have a conceptualization at the network scale, either a network of spatiotemporal connectivity, either network structure and the connectivity hotspots, how are influencing and how we'll respond to land use changes. So at the end, trying to understand how diversity will be shaped by these 2 layers towards a new type of diversity, so a post-disturbance or a future community. Of course, all this framed within the meta-community theory, the graph and network theory, and the null and neutral simulations. I think that I don't have to introduce you the meta-community theory, but basically when we are talking about the interplay of the local scale and the regional scale, or the alpha and beta aspects of any type of approximation, we are in the meta-community framework, which basically understands a meta-community as a set of local communities that are linked by dispersal of multiple interacting species. A lot has happened since the beginning of meta-community theory, let's say, and nowadays we are kind of conceptualizing it as three different axes that are changing and that are shaping the assembly of our communities. Basically, we have the dispersal axis, the abiotic axis, and the biotic interactions axis. If we imagine our layers, or the layers that I've been working with, disturbance somehow would impact all these layers, both abiotic, and dispersal, and network structure, in my case, that I understand it at a special scale, will shape the dispersal axis. But of course, we could also apply a network structure for biotic interactions using graphical lasso or network analysis traits, and also for abiotic responses, understanding, for example, the difference at the experimental level. But so far, what I have been mostly focusing on is at the spatial scale on how network and disturbance are interacting between each other. At the end, if we imagine a set of ponds that are connected into the landscape, we can also imagine a network. Understanding, of course, that a network is something else than a nice graph. It needs to have a sense, And basically, we understand it as each node being a community, in our case, a pond, and each link being an effective dispersal path. So organisms are able to move from this point to this other, and therefore, the network structure is somehow capturing how dispersal is going on in our network. But based on this structure, actually, we could imagine to apply neutral theory and the conceptualizations of random extinction, dispersal, and speciation on this network landscape. How? Basically, we could simulate communities. In this case, imagine that we have this community of black and white dots that has a determined composition. But suddenly there is a disturbance that kills part of these organisms or these individuals in a random basis. But later, after this disturbance, there is a recolonization that at the end finishes by changing the composition of our community, having different blacks and white species, and even a new one that came from a neighboring community. This disturbance cycle actually can be repeated and give birth to what we call a coalescent or neutral models. These tools have been used, or I've been using these tools in different approaches. First, to understand how landscape is shaping diversity and how different habitats might be favoring or not favoring diversity, for example, permanent habitats or temporary habitats, but also in designing different scenarios of disturbance. For example, imagining more intense and bigger scenarios and the diversity that will be related to this type of scenarios, and therefore link them to the resistance of the network against this type of scenarios or of future scenarios. All this information is somehow wrapped up in the MetaHeroes project. Of course, drinking from the meta community, the graph and network theories, and the null and neutral simulation approximations. That is why I've been explaining you all these, because basically they frame the whole conceptual structure of MetaHeroes, because MetaHeroes is looking at a global crisis with a silent threat, which is a fragmented future, basically the loss of connectivity throughout time, but also on freshwater salinization, because it's the change on the abiotic conditions that is linked to human. Basically, freshwater salinization is used as a proxy of human impacts, let's say. But the most important one is fragmentation and the loss of centrality, or the changes in centrality throughout time. This is shaped in a network that in our case is a pond network or a pondscape, and therefore ponds are the habitats that we use to understand how these two main layers, the change in habitat conditions, but also the loss of connectivity, will shape diversity in the future. And more specifically, we will also use mesocosms that are kind of a small pond reproduction. Why? Because ponds have communities that are connected by dispersal. There is a strong role of different dispersal capacities in the composition and the organismal groups that thrive in ponds, and that at the end has a repercussion on the network structure and the network strengths against these threats. Therefore, the link between all these concepts is kind of echoing inside the MetaHeroes project. So basically, we have a community, we have an habitat and a network that will be shaped by different types of disturbances. The first one is the loss of habitat, and the second one is the change in habitat conditions. So we have these two layers that I've been talking about, disturbance and network structure changing. So this is what wraps the MetaHeroes project. Basically tries to understand the consequences and interaction of connectivity loss and local stressor for biodiversity in habitat networks, and try to assess the role of connectivity in maintaining community resistance against disturbances. We will do this throughout 3 work packages that now I'll introduce very rapidly. The first one is an experimental test, which tries to understand how connectivity is safeguarding communities against salinity stress. So basically what we will do is an experimental test using mesocosms and communities that respond to different salinities, and then reproducing different gradient on centrality and isolation, or let's say connectivity. So what we will do is try to test the importance of connectivity in this, providing more resistance to the impact of salinity and specifically of a disturbance pulse or a disturbance salinity, disturbance. Basically, what we want to do with this is look for an habitat that somehow has this natural gradient and that has different communities adapted to more saline and less saline environments, but also that has a nice centrality isolation pattern. This is the bomb crater ponds, where we want to do an experiment setting up mesocosms and more isolated locations and more central locations to reproduce and have the natural dispersal strengths and the natural communities that are moving between sites. Of course, thanks to this configuration of this habitat, we can somehow reproduce this gradient on dispersal, but also have inside this network communities that are adapted to freshwater conditions and communities that are adapted to saline conditions. And then we can somehow add salinity at some point of this experiment to impact half of our mesocosm settings, and of course monitor all this and compare between control and disturbed, saline origin or non-saline origin, more central or more isolated. At the end, what we would expect is that more central communities here in blue will have higher diversity and will respond, but will be anyway impacted, but less impacted than more isolated in clear blue. Of course, this is a project that we are carrying on and that it's ongoing and that we will do in spring 2024, that we are preparing with the whole team in the Metacom lab that are being super helpful with their knowledge and their know-how on deploying mesocosms and working with them. The second work package is an empirical long-term study. Basically, what we will have is try to assess the role of connectivity and habitat loss in diversity in an area that has lost constantly their habitat. As we know, it's pondscape located nearby Hungary, actually in the border between Austria and Hungary, that has been losing the connectivity throughout time. But the good point of this experiment is that actually we have the diversity, so samplings, at these 3 points in time. Therefore, we somehow can relate the diversity of these ponds, of this system at specific moments of the time, and how the network was looking at these specific moments. So assess fragmentation in a real pondscape on the impacts of fragmentation on diversity through time. We have started to do that already, and the point is to look at the trend that diversity is following throughout this time. What we have seen already with raw data is that there is already some changes in diversity, and that somehow looks that at the beginning the loss is more stronger, but the pattern is a bit fuzzy. It's not that clear, and there is a lot of changes and nuances on this. The point here is to try to use these approximations or these neutral approximations to somehow simulate diversity linked to the loss of landscape structure and then related with the empirical point. This is something that I will do with Dr. Jonathan Chase in the ID, or with the help of him in the ID. And the last work package to end is the modeling and fragmentation, and stress in randomized scenarios. Basically, what we want to do is benefit from work package 1 and 2 and try to reproduce in silico diversity changes linked to habitat loss and network fragmentation. So basically use all the approximations or all the knowledge that we generated and somehow reproduce the diversity at a wider scale, diversity changes linked to land cover changes, because we have the projections of these land changes at different scenarios throughout time. at the EU, Hungarian, or other countries level. Basically, our point is to try to assess how the centrality isolation gradient might impact and will respond against future scenarios of habitat loss, and specifically its conservation. Because at the end, what we will do here is that we have a species pool that responds differently to different types of land use. We know that we have the changes of this land use throughout time. So somehow we can manage to get everything inside this simulation and generate a baseline of alpha, beta, and gamma diversity that respond to the change on this landscape through time. But the good point is that then, once we have this, we can ask a question. We can say, what if we conserve a percentage of this landscape? What if we add a percentage of new ponds in this landscape? What if we improve this type of landscape? This means that we can get another alpha, beta, and gamma diversity patterns, compare them, and then assess, for example, which type or how many percentage we need to somehow break the diversity loss that we would expect, or what we should do to somehow palliate or be more resilient to the changes that are somehow projected in the future to come. This, in a nutshell, would be the MetaHeroes project and its 3 work packages. But the point of all this is not to explain it to you here in video, is to meet me and to discuss with me if you want, or contact me. I either in person in the Institute of Aquatic Ecology, either by email or by Twitter. So I can just say kesenem to everyone. Thank you so much to my team and to everyone, and I hope to meet you sooner or later.